Hi, everyone. I'm back. A couple weeks, I think, now since I put out an episode. So, sorry if you've been waiting, or if having a break from having to listen to me has been quite nice for you. Well, I'm sorry to return so quickly. So, on the episode today, I have Aaron Collins. Aaron is a mechanical engineer and has been running a YouTube channel the past year or so, doing tests on masks and doing reviews for masks and just trying to get some good, solid data and scientific information out there regarding masks. So, not surprisingly, this is another episode about masks, and I hope you enjoy it. I sure enjoyed this conversation. So, cheers, guys. All right. Well, thanks for coming on, Aaron. And so first, go over your background and then what got you into working on masks during the pandemic and how you got going on your YouTube channel.
Sure. Yeah. So my background is I have an undergraduate and master's degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. And my master's research was in particle dilution systems for diesel aerosol emissions. So like when diesel engines or cars or trucks drive around, right, they're spewing out tiny little nanoparticles. And some of the work that a lot of people wanted to explore is kind of how do you measure those? So that was my master's work. And then I didn't realize that aerosols would be my interest, but I was an intern at a large aerosol company called MSP Corporation. When I started there in 2005 or 2006. And so I worked there all the way up until 2012 as I grew up there. Basically, I started as an intern and I worked my way up and eventually I was an engineer and worked in designing particle counters, what we call condensation particle counters. The same tool that I used in my mass work, I have designed a couple of those and have a couple of patents in that space. So I kind of, my engineering career started and really revolved around aerosols from the very beginning. And it's something that I enjoyed. It's very fundamental research. So you kind of like very classic analysis. You have a particle, it's suspended in air. What happens to it if you increase the temperature or humidity or all these things, right? It's just kind of like fundamental physics. And so that's kind of my background. Now, how did I get into mass testing? Well, as part of that work, so when I was going through undergraduate and graduate school, it's kind of like the post-SARS-1 COVID kind of condition. And there was always kind of this hypothesis by the aerosol engineering community and aerosol scientists was like, I think this spreads by aerosols, right? And so they kind of the conversations of masks, and we saw that happen in Asian countries, during the beginning of this pandemic, right? Starting to adopt masks, right? This all kind of came from this notion that people were kind of understanding that symptomatic people were spreading these various droplets and aerosols. And the kind of assumption was like the aerosol challenge existed then, like proving airborne was just a challenge of SARS-CoV-1. And so that kind of was like something you'd learned about. And then the pandemic hit and, we started talking about cloth masks and I was like, okay, that makes sense. Melt blown is going to be a little challenge to get. It's not, we don't make that many respirators a year, or masks as we often call them, and kind of in a common vernacular. And so the question was like, how long is it going to take to ramp? So, okay, yeah, let's do cloth masks, right? We can kind of get, you're going to get pretty good capture rates. So when you breathe out, you'll capture the droplets. It's not going to give a ton of protection to the wearer, but if everyone wears one, right, we can help slow the rate until we get N95s to everyone or our other, good respirators, right? And so I was kind of waiting for that to happen. And then I was kind of like, this is strange because it's like August and, we kind of, like maybe the evidence isn't perfectly clear yet for airborne, but I think there's a really overwhelming body of knowledge that's kind of pointing everyone in that direction. And so kind of good prudence is to say, well, okay, we don't know for sure, but we should assume it is. And let's, if it is droplets or aerosols, N95 for both for great, or excuse me, great for both. You can use a respirator to stop droplets and you can use a respirator to also stop aerosols, and it works in both directions. So August kind of came around and I was like, all right, this is weird. And then, of course, there's a whole political discussion about masks and some of the politicization that happened around that. And so it kind of was starting to dawn on me, like, they're not taking this seriously. Now, of course, there's been a lot of other discussion in this space, right, about what happened with kind of how the World Health Organization termed aerosol spread, this notion that it had to be 5 micron or smaller. And somehow, as soon as it was 6 micron, it was a droplet, even though, I think you had, who did you just have on your show just recently? I think you just had Jose
Jimenez,
Jimenez, from UC Boulder. Right? So, aerosol people are like, it's not different. It's 5 micron to 6 micron. It's really not different. It's like they're very similar mechanisms, right? Yeah, when you get to the 100 micron, okay, we start, it's just this kind of continuous regime of change. And so I was like, well, this is, if it is, we need to start getting some good mass. And at the time, I had N95s for my own use from doing home projects, and I had P100s. I'd given those P100s to my father and mother-in-law and like to people around me. So I'm like, I'd like to get a mask because we kind of, the data's looking good. Why I should buy some. And then KN95s, and you start digging into it. And you're like, oh man, that's really a bummer that there's good mass in KN95s and bad mass in KN95s. Some that don't perform very well, where they're kind of skipping out on the melt blown or using really low quality. And that melt blown, what I'm referencing is the filtration media inside the mask. And so that's like the kind of what I always like to call like the magic material or our technology, right? It's this polypropylene material that we kind of do some advanced engineering with. We make really tiny filaments. They get electrostatically charged. They work great for capturing particles. And so KN95s all over the place. Some were good, some were bad. And the CDC was testing some of these, the NPTTL, a National Protection Testing Laboratory, I think something like that. They were testing and they were publishing their data, which was really cool because you're seeing, oh yeah, there are good masks out there. Except there was only one piece of the puzzle, which was there were good masks. The challenge was, where the heck do you get them from, right? So like, how could you buy these? So you're seeing this data that are good masks, but they don't tell you where they came from. And then you go try to search that name and like for example, one of the more common KN95s that I reference in my videos a lot is the Powcom, made by the Powcom Labor Insurance Company. Now, for my, in English language, and as a native English language speaker, that doesn't quite make sense from a mask company to be talking about labor insurance. That seems like a very strange business to enter into mass. So you're kind of like, is that real? And so, you're kind of not sure. And I, in kind of passing, was kind of annoyed by this. And I was told my wife, I was like, man, this is so stupid. And she's like, well, why don't you just test them? Like, don't you know how to do that? And I was kind of like, oh, I guess I kind of do know how to do that. And I do kind of have all the things I need in the basement. I guess I didn't really think I'd be the one to be the one to do that. But I was like, all right. So I started buying masks from websites with the goal of like, okay, let's see if I can start to source like some reasonably good quality protective face masks or respirators, right? So I started looking at KN95s and KF94s, and then avoiding the N95s because there was clearly still a shortage of N95s. So healthcare workers that I talked to that I know personally were like, hey, yeah, I have to reuse the same mask like 7 times before I get a new one, right? And like, you're kind of like, yeah, I'm not going to buy one of those. Those are for you. You're dealing with, you're dealing with patients who are COVID positive or could be COVID positive. Like, we're going to leave those supplies. Could I find some general population masks? And so I just started buying them, and I happen to have all the equipment I needed in my basement that mostly works. So I repaired some of it, got it. I got it up and running, and then I just started like testing them and having a spreadsheet. And then I shared it with some of my fellow engineering friends. And then, the first question that anyone asks is like, how do I know what you're doing is right? I mean, everyone tests masks. They blow through the mask. They test for smells. They, all these things we saw.
Putting to blow on a candle or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And so basically, I was like, well, what I'll do is I'll videotape myself doing it, showing my apparatus, and you can see the results, and then you can kind of see what I'm doing and how I'm. Because a lot of people are like, oh, how is it held against your face? Like, how do you know this isn't happening? And they're all good, legitimate questions, right? You're some random friend of yours is saying that he found a mask that's pretty protective that you can buy. Like, why wouldn't everyone be using this if this was the case, Aaron? Like, that's kind of strange. So I just started taping it, and then I put it on YouTube because that I always like put like videos on YouTube. It's just easy, and I set that one to public, and I didn't think anything about it because I was sharing it to my friends. So I just set it to public. So if someone searched it, they found it, and people started searching for it. And I thought it was so strange that people were watching this video and then leaving comments like, "Oh, hey, where did you get those masks from?" Like, because I was like, I put the title like, I don't remember, like testing KF94 masks or something like that. And yeah, so people started leaving comments, and I realized that there was a lot of interest in it from people that were asking. And I figured, wow, if I can get 1,000 people, like 1,000 views would be like amazing. That'd be so cool. And so I just kept kind of doing it because I was trying to find better masks too for people around me, like coworkers and stuff like that. Just like, hey, do they exist out there? And I kept doing that and kept testing masks. And I don't know what I'm up to. Like I think I was over 150 masks tested since August of last year, and I just kept doing it. And then I kept publishing. I got better with video editing, and I had some help with that. And that's kind of how it all kicked off.
So what have you been finding with all your mask testing? Which ones have come out at the top, and have you come across any that are just completely useless for the application that they're supposed to be doing?
Yeah, I think so. To me, the big surprise, well, I wouldn't say it was necessarily a surprise. The more I dug into it, the more it made sense. But the Korean KF94 standard and the method that they implemented it is how you. I mean, there's some improvements to be made, so it's not perfect. I'm an engineer, so we always strive for perfection.
Good thing,
But in general, the KF94 standard is a really good approach, which is, hey, we're going to come up with a standard for general population. So like these are for masks to be worn by people who are not healthcare workers. This is not their occupation. So like if this mask fails, they're not instantly going to die from asbestos or something, right? We're talking about general masks for general population that are protective. And they have it backed by the Korean FDA, so that you have to submit all your forms. You have to be locally registered. You have all these things, just kind of like what we would do with our FDA. I mean, it's not quite. I'm not an expert in the sense that I've combed through all the Korean FDA rules and regulations because I don't speak Korean and I can't even read it. So, but in general, the gist that I've gotten from this is that it's maybe not as completely strict as, let's say, like a NIOSH. In terms of like the quality checks and audit systems, like they do audit stuff, but maybe like NIOSH is like a smidgen more aggressive. But in general, they have an FDA system. They have a quality system baked into it. And so they're testing the masks, and you have to prove that they work. You have to have a quality system in place proving that you're testing and doing audits. And like you have all these things you have to prove that you're doing as like a legitimate manufacturer of masks. And what I found in every KF94 I've tested is that they performed really well. Like there are like some of the best masks. Every mask that I have, the KF94s represent typically the top 20% of the masks I test are all KF94s. And so to me, it highlighted like if you have a good government standard for masks for general population, you can be pretty successful in making good masks. KN95s, the Chinese standards, yeah, they're kind of all over the board. I saw some, in general, if they, there was some fakes. I got some, Amazon KN95s where you'd order them from Amazon and they were complete garbage. I mean, they were completely fake. They only offered like maybe 30 or 40% protection, which is like on par with a cloth mask. So they're basically like the equivalent cloth mask. And basically they just didn't have any melt blown in them. Someone was cheating the system and figured they'd make a few quick bucks. And they sold fake masks. So there was definitely that issue with KN95s. They're kind of all over the board. Now there were good KN95s, but I mean, how would you know just looking at them? You couldn't. You need a specialty tester like I had to do that kind of work. And so that kind of, it's kind of hard to recommend them when you can't prove that they're always going to work well. I think, and the other thing that kind of came out from that is just that cloth masks weren't really effective for inhalation protection. And we kind of saw that over and over again. There's a lot of people that have studied that, kind of showing, they're in the 30, 40, 50% range. Face fit's really important. But that data kind of showed up in mine as well. It's like, yeah, they're not, I mean, is it better than zero? Yes. Would I wear a cloth mask over no mask? Yes. Would I wear a really nice KF94 that's going to give me like, for my face and my tester also 99% filtration efficiency? Yeah, I'm going to pick that any day over the week over 50%. But, at the time, cloth masks were what they were. So I think that was the surprising thing, that KF94s and general population mask standards do work, and you can generate. I mean, Korea was turning out KF94s like, they shut down exports for them for quite a while. You couldn't buy them in the U.S. They were unavailable until late August. They had turned off any exports of KF94 and KF80 masks coming out of South Korea, and they only turned it back on once they had an overabundant supply domestically. Which if you have to think about how many masks they were turning out, I mean, they exploded in there. They were turning out so many masks. So yeah, it's pretty incredible.
You mentioned the KN95s. Have you come across anybody else that's been distributing really bad KN95s? Like you mentioned Amazon, and I've heard that a lot before too. And a lot of the ones that are circulating on Amazon are of really poor quality. Is there anywhere else in particular that you've come across that are selling the ones that are completely useless?
Yeah, so so in the beginning, I kind of did that work. So I was just ordering them from Amazon to try to see what was out there. And I realized very quickly that I could search for bad masks and it would not be hard to find. But I realized that like that the value of that isn't really there, right? Because like, sure, I can show you that there's bad KN95s, but if you're trying to get good masks, does that really help you? And the answer is no, not really. So I chose to focus my energy on finding good mask suppliers. And so oftentimes what I focus most of my energy is on like vetting suppliers. So Powcom was imported by a US company called Bonafide Masks, which first of all, I was kind of like, I don't know if I really trust this company. They just started up Bonafide Masks. And then I kind of dug into their history, and they're, importing masks, and they're the US's largest manufacturer of ball chains. So think like the chains that hang from like lights, those little like metal balls or like dog tags.
Yeah.
the person that owned that company, that's what they manufactured before this. And then somehow they had some distributorship with this company and were importing Powcom. So to me, I started like, okay, I found a good mask. Now let's figure out who's importing them, how consistently they import. Hey, if you import, how do you know that they're good? Oh, you're going straight to do you go to a third party distributor, or are you importing straight from the manufacturer? Do you periodically test these? Are you doing any internal qualification? Is the supplier, so I started actually qualifying suppliers and trying to generate like legitimate sources to buy masks versus I could spend the energy to go to Amazon and buy some. That's why I said just avoid Amazon, because Amazon, there's so many sellers. There's a very low barrier to entry. And all bifold KN95s look the same. So we're just like, oh, KN95, it must be good. It's got stamp on it. Well, turns out that's just a stamp on the side. So I didn't spend a ton of time looking for fakes, but they were there, and you could get it in. And it's anywhere that they weren't like legitimate distributors.
And what were some of the other, you mentioned your focus on the quality ones, then what were some of the other, quality masks besides maybe the, high-end respirators that you were starting to come across that are more available to the general public, akin to the KN94s?
So you mean like what masks other than like KF94s were out there that were like good quality, or?
Yeah, that you'd come across with your testing.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There was, there were good KN95 masks, and so there was like U.S. manufacturers that kind of popped up. One of them was like a partner with a Chinese company, but I think they were originally called Honest PPE, and then I think unfortunately that name and
just the best names out of these companies.
Yeah, well, it's kind of weird. They're kind of, it's a weird. To me, that's probably one of the most interesting topics of the whole thing. Is it's very easy to sit and look at these companies and be like, oh, you're just like trying to profit off the pandemic, right? Are you really trying to do good, or are you just trying to make money? So like things like Honest PPE, I kind of first saw them like, okay, and then they had to change their name to Well Before. And first I was like, well, that's kind of weird. They changed their name. Like that's kind of weird to have happened in like a 6-month period. Now it turns out, if you look out on the Target shelves, there might be another brand out there with that name that didn't like them using that, and they probably didn't do enough due diligence at that point in time. But turns out that they were, that their masks actually were pretty highly protective, and they were importing some Chinese KN95s that they were kind of working with them to kind of develop their own versions of. So it's more like a white label of an existing product, but actually they were highly protective. Not the most breathable mask. So in terms of like where my favorite mask, not wrestling, but they were making a really protective mask. And there was U.S. manufacturers like Lutima, which was out of, I think they're out of San Diego. And they were making them. And there was a small company in I think they were in Kentucky called Bluegrass Masks. So there was like these U.S. companies that were trying to create PPE. And so those were kind of cool to see. And so we did find some like legitimate sources in the U.S. of like U.S. made PPE. I think that the problem was at the time is that even if there was just not enough momentum to get them into distributorship in the U.S. because we had this weird thing where you couldn't search for N95s. And if you're a U.S. company, you're not going to say, hey, I'm a U.S. company, I'm going to test against KN95 standard, right? I'm a U.S. company, I'm going to test against American standards. And the American standard is the N95, but I can't advertise my product as an N95 on Amazon, Google, or eBay or anywhere. I get taken off. So you had like legitimate supply in the U.S. and it's still happening today, right? That they just can't get them out. So to me, that was actually one of the most interesting discoveries was like finding U.S. suppliers of PPE, talking to them, and they're saying, I have lots of masks to sell. And then talking to people that are in like the healthcare world saying, I don't have any masks. And you're kind of like, what the heck is going on here? And the sort of like huge mismatch between the suppliers and the hospitals and how our PPE distribution system is. Learning about that was probably, to me, as a non-engineering aspect of it, was pretty interesting to learn, like, how does PPE get distributed in the U.S.? How do these giant hospital buyers work? And the more you talk to like mask companies and reach out to like these like PPE acquisition companies, and if anyone who I would talk to anyone who would talk to me and like, hey, tell me, are you out of masks? Do you have masks? And most of the time they're like, yeah, we got plenty of masks. And they're like, what the heck? Why are we seeing healthcare workers not having masks? And you're like, oh, because we have lots of masks that aren't 3M and Moldex, and everyone's fitted at the hospitals to 3M and Moldex and these brand names, Honeywell masks. Those were in short supply. But if you were not that brand name, hospitals didn't want to buy from you anyways, because then they'd have to go refit all of their employees. And so there's the whole U.S. And I could go for an hour just talking about the U.S. N95 standard, our lack of a general population test standard, and our lack of any testing standards for respirators besides a NIOSH N95 really hampered us in a deployment of respirators in the U.S.
So how did that come to be such a lack of standard?
Well, I mean, I think you have to go back to I'm not in, I mean, the real experts on this are industrial hygienists. So from my understanding, right. So I'll caveat that. Like
Right.
I didn't know much. I mean, I knew what an N95 and a P100 was before this. I knew how they worked. I did not know the history of them. And I didn't really, I mean, why would I really care? Like it was something you wore when if you're doing lead abatement or scraping paint in your house or sanding something, you might throw on an N95, right? Like at the time, I didn't really care about the history. I knew how they worked. I knew what they did, and I knew, the details I needed to, but I didn't know the history. And as you start looking back at the history about, how did NIOSH come around to the N95 standard? How did we end up with requiring headbands, which is like this notion that, there's kind of this weird partnership between, as I understand it, between NIOSH and OSHA, which is NIOSH has this N95 standard, and OSHA says, well, if you wear an N95 that NIOSH certifies, you have to get fit tested. And a fit test is a mechanism that healthcare workers and people that are in, like, PPE is your last line of defense, right? So normally when we design safe systems, we put in engineering controls first, so that you don't need PPE, because we don't want to rely on PPE, because PPE can be misused and then the person gets exposed. So that's our last barrier of protection. And so OSHA was like recognizing that risk and said, okay, if we're going to have N95s, then we're going to have them fitted. So you have to make sure that they fit your face. And they use different techniques to do that. And the requirement effectively is that you have to have less than 1% leakage. So this notion that I kept hearing news companies talk about was like, oh, N95s provide 95% protection. Well, yes and no. Like the standard is very strange because the filtration media is N95 rating, meaning 95% at a certain flow rate and a certain particle size, which is this real nuanced discussion that creates confusion for people that aren't familiar with the standards, which is a mistake in itself. And then you have this like media that you're breathing through, but then you have leakage that comes around the mask. That just goes between your skin and the mask surface. And basically those particles can leak around there. So you can imagine, like if you just took your mask, like an N95 respirator, and you kicked it open off the side of your face and breathed in, and most of the air is going around the mask, well, that doesn't give you 95% protection because it's leaking around it. So they make it that you have to qualify a mask fitting to be like around 1%. And that's like in a couple of different motions and face stuff. Now, the more broader discussion is, well, does it really give you 99%? No. If you dig in the literature, they talk about, this protection factor, which is really, they assume it will actually only give you 90% protection in real world scenarios, because the mask is always, you're moving around, you're doing stuff, and the seal is constantly moving. And so there's always this kind of leakage. But the spec was, hey, you got to test at 99%. Well, if you think about that, you're effectively, for COVID aerosols, respiratory droplets, they're pretty big relative to the test standard, 100 nanometers or a 0.1 micron, as you kind of see that number thrown around all the time. That comes from this NIOSH test standard. And respiratory droplets are typically about, on the smaller size, a half micron, let's say. There's some nuance there about how you measure that and what relative humidity. And if fellow aerosol people are listening, they'll say like, well, it kind of depends, Aaron. But let's say roughly half micron, like on the small side. So it's like 5 times bigger than the test aerosol. So it turns out for most of these medias at half micron, they're highly efficient, beyond 95, beyond 99. I mean, some are approaching like, 99.9 plus, right, at that particle size range. So it becomes dominated by leakage. So if you look at the NIOSH tests or the OSHA test requirement of 1% leakage, and at half micron, you're effectively like a N99. I mean, you're getting 99% protection if it's fitted, right? So like it's really high. And it turns out, you could have some pretty high levels of leakage. You could have, 5 times the leakage and still have an N95 spec on a face mask for COVID droplets. So we set this really high threshold for occupational safety, which makes sense for occupational safety. If this is your only thing protecting, of course that makes sense. For the general population, do we need 99% protection? And should we keep people at 30 or 40% protection because we're afraid of not getting 99% protection? It was kind of this weird discussion, like N95s can't be used because you need to be fitted. We heard that a lot, or they're hard to breathe in, which is totally not true. And so, there's this weird disconnect between the occupational side and that's test standards and just like what we would need in a pandemic. And the history that goes back to the 70s and protecting workers, and in the 80s, and the standard was written in 95. And in my opinion, it's probably something we should revisit because the specs on it are really bad, right? Like the breathability requirements, like I don't even think you can buy a mask that would not pass the spec by like an order of magnitude, like not an order of magnitude, but 2x or 3x the spec, right? Like technology has moved so far since 1995 that we can kind of revisit this. No one's making masks that would fail this. Like we should improve this spec, So it's just, it's kind of a bummer that we never fixed it, and we still haven't yet, right? There's still no general population mask standard in the US. And we have this ASTM standard for cloth masks, which is really not anywhere near a respirator level. We're talking, 50, 70. Is it better than a cloth alone? Sure. Is it anywhere near what you could get out of a high-end melt-blown mask? No, not anywhere close. So we still lack that standard in the US.
So have you come across anybody that's tried to look into something during the pandemic to circumvent all of this? Because as you mentioned, it's really seemed to hinder the whole mask distribution process. And as you mentioned, a lot of it is very important to have a high standard. It's like in an industrial or agricultural setting, like you have to be that precise about it, so people aren't breathing in a wide array of shit that'll take your lungs right out. But yeah, has anybody in government looked into finding out an override for this for the sake of the general public buying their own masks at a store apropos to the pandemic?
Well, that's $1 million question. I mean, so I don't think so. I think what happened is that masks became political, and I think
you don't say.
Yeah, in my opinion, some of what the work the CDC was doing was being impacted by this, because maybe there's some good background that I missed, but from an outside person looking at this, like an engineer looking at this and saying, okay, are we really trying to solve the problem? And you're looking at the decision making and you're like, that doesn't seem like that's what you would try to do if you're trying to solve this issue, right? If you really think it's aerosol spread, if you're having this indications, why isn't the FDA or someone stepping in and saying, okay, we're going to do this? So a couple of things happened that I think are important. One, the FDA did recognize it early for healthcare workers and gave the emergency use authorization, which allowed certain select KN95 brands into the US, because those are the only ones that would apply for it at the time. Remember, South Korea made KF94s, which were pretty good, and other masks that fit their own standards that were actually good enough, but they said, hey, we're not exporting them. So you couldn't get them in the US anyway. So China was saying, hey, we got masks, let's sell them to the US. So you had the Emergency Use Authorization Act. So they were trying to bypass a little bit of that. But then you at the same time had the fake KN95 issue. So then everyone's like, okay, great. So the fake KN95s, but that's what you want me to use to wear in place of my N95 that I would normally wear from 3M or Honeywell. So people are like, what the heck's going on here? So you did see US brands coming online to try to manufacture N95s, and a lot of them kicked off. And NIOSH did give a special authorization to NIOSH approval, N95 approval. So I can't, if you look at their NIOSH approval, I think the first two letters are SH, I think, or something like that. That was like a special, a fast pass to get your respirator approved. So some things were kind of happening in the background. But again, when we talk about N95s, they were restricted to healthcare workers. So all the things we're talking about were like good things to do for healthcare workers, but it completely excluded the general population mass. And so that was good for the N95 world, but not so, or healthcare workers trying to help them out, but not for general population. In general population, there was really nothing. No one was talking about it. We had fellow aerosol scientists doing work, and they're trying to do good work, testing cloths and testing all these materials to try to figure out the best. And you're kind of like, okay, I mean, I guess that makes sense a little bit, but, we could just turn on melt blowing machines, right? Like we could be building these. It takes a few months. We could build a melt blowing line. We have manufacturers in the US that are doing this. Let's go turn these melt blowing lines up and start, getting these things out of the mothballs or start building new ones. Maybe it'll take us 6 months, but if you start in February, by the summertime, you'll be turning out melt blowing and we'll all be good. And it never happened. And so we did see a little bit of movement with ASTM trying to create a cloth mask standard to try to get, because we had all these boutique cloth, everyone was making cloth masks. People are hand sewing them. Companies were making them, making claims about how great they were, and all the magic they could do with no data to support it, no test standard applied to it. So you have no idea as a consumer what level of you are. And of course, no one ever told people, and I didn't spend too much time talking about this even in my work because it was such a complex topic, that, hey, the cloth ranges are huge, right? Like a lace mask, like literally that you can see through, it's not going to provide you any protection at all or any protection to others. And so, but there's no requirement that you can't wear a lace mask, right? There's no, it can be mesh for all the technical requirements are. I mean, it's a face covering. So it's a mess. It's a mess. It still is a mess. Anyone in government, though, you did have there was like a consortium of US-based mask manufacturers that created, I can't remember the name of the organization, but like Lloyd Armbrust out of Texas, and Armbrust Mask was on that, and I think Lutima as well. We're trying to get like a group of mask manufacturers together to try to like lobby the government to do some of these things that we're talking about. But it's over a year later, I still yet to see anything on my end, I mean, I'm not involved in the government, and I've kind of turned down my mask paying attention a little bit the last month to get back to my regular life. But I haven't seen anything happen. So I think I hope it's not one of those things where we just move on from the pandemic, or like, okay, we know what to do and we'll deal with it later. Because I think, strike while the iron is hot, we should be looking at general population mask standards for the US and same with Europe, right? I mean, they don't have them either. They have FFP2, I guess, which is close enough, but coming up with techniques for how to do this in the future is going to be very important.
Yeah, it's the same issue here too. Like people can just wear whatever. Even like I still see people wearing those like neck gaiters for hunting. I just see the odd guy wearing that. Like, buddy, what the fuck are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, the neck gaiters. But and that to me is the fundamental. Like to me, like the American thing is like, I'm going to protect myself, right? We have like Second Amendment right, people that are really into guns and like want to protect themselves from if someone attacks them. We have gun rights in Texas, all this stuff, like how to protect yourself. And to me, the irony is that same thing happens with good respirators. Is that person wearing a neck gaiter, if you're wearing a good respirator, a KF94, FFP2, N95, or a good KN95, they protect you from that individual. So if they were COVID positive and they chose to wear a neck gaiter, it doesn't matter to you, right? You have the protection built into you. You don't have to worry about other people. This whole notion of relying on people to do the right thing, like I wear my mask to protect others and I should do that, was clearly a wrong decision, because it turns out that you can't rely on other people in a pandemic to always do the right thing. Now, are they intentionally doing the wrong thing because they just don't know? Well, yeah,
it's a wide array of reasons.
Yeah, right. There's misinformation out there. People didn't know. I mean, and no one ever talked to. I mean, they still don't, right? Like except for you. You've now interviewed 2 people involved in the aerosol world, but most news publications, who are the people they go to? They talk to doctors. And this isn't a criticism of all the doctors out there. Just most doctors don't really know anything about aerosols. That's not their background.
They're technicians. They're not scientists.
Right. And so you have this problem that the authority of healthcare is doctors. And, from my perspective, I always like, why is when I look at it from my perspective, it's industrial hygienists. This is what they do for a living. They understand like exposure limits and all these like things that we talk about and about how we use respirators and all that's industrial hygienists. And you never see them interviewed in the newspaper, right? When you say, what should you wear for the best mask? It's like pick some random doctor that happens to have an expertise in epidemiology, but doesn't know anything about the physics. And they're the source of information for the news article. And so it's not, and the newspapers, they don't want to have to explain who an industrial hygienist is, right? It doesn't sell newspapers. They want to know the doctor. He's the guy that knows everything about everything. He's going to make sure I don't get COVID. He's saying wear this is what I should do. And so it gets, it's just, it's a mess. to keep it succinct, it's a mess.
Yeah, and like you mentioned before, my talk with Dr. Jimenez, and like most of what he spoke about, which I was surprised, we really focused in that conversation on just the dogma and the orthodoxy that he's had to run into. Have you come across the same sort of thing the past year of getting a lot of pushback against aerosol science and the concept of just that large droplets and is the main thing, and so any sort of mask to just sort of drop to stop the large droplets, and then having social distancing being paramount or being the main things, and any other sort of mask particulars are just a bit frivolous.
Yeah, I mean, I think yes. I mean, I get emails, and I have. I mean, my YouTube comment section got. I would just delete them because I have a little bit different vantage point because I don't have to go convince people who are in good faith not understanding the issue, right? Like, the World Health Organization and some of those medical experts weren't in bad faith thinking like it wasn't true. They just didn't understand, and there was a little bit of hubris that they were unwilling to understand, right? That I'm an expert, I know everything about this. Why would I listen to this? One of this aerosol people who are these people? You go to the American Aerosol Conference and there's maybe 600 people there, right? Like it's a small group in the U.S. and worldwide it's maybe a couple thousand, right? It's a tiny segment of the scientific knowledge base of these people, and so I can understand it. In my world, I had people that were trying to spread misinformation, right? That masks don't work. If masks work, why is COVID still spreading? We're all wearing masks, right? Like you just can't fight that level of disinformation, because even if I made a video explaining, okay, this is why cloth masks work, and this is the mechanism that they work. This is the level that they work at. They help slow the rate. They're not going to eliminate the problem. You could spend hours trying to discredit all of the fire hose of misinformation. And most of it was bad actors trying to do stuff, right? Like they're not trying to argue in good faith. They're not trying to understand the issues. So I kind of had the advantage that from my platform, it's kind of one directional, right? I can just put information out there. And so that's what I did with the YouTube series that I made. I would just spend time explaining, this is all the things you need to know about math. Here's all these little nuances. Here's why these things matter, right? And so I could have this nice little one directional platform where I could kind of just broadcast the message out. And if the message came back, if there was people that really had questions, of course, I'd spend time to answer them or answer them in videos. But if you're a bad faith actor, I could just say, okay, I'm not going to talk to you. I don't have to. Not that that's always the best thing. Personally, I had experience with people not understanding what aerosol was. In fact, in June of last year, the daycare that my son was at, I was trying to explain to them, because they were saying Minneapolis actually had implemented a mask standard saying, hey, everyone, all adults over the age of 2, or anyone over the age of 2 needs to be wearing a face covering, right? And the daycare I was at was like, we're not going to do that. We don't want masks. And the parents at the daycare were like, because I'm trying to explain to them and argue, like, no, we should really think about masks for the teachers for sure. Like, we're going to see, when we talk about respiratory droplets and how they get generated, the teachers are going to be, they're going to be they're on the older end of the age range. They're not really young. So we already know they're going to be impacted. So we need to protect them. And if we can get kids to wear masks, blah, blah, blah. But basically they were told, like, if you want kids to wear a mask, go to a different school. Eventually, the irony is that they end up all wearing masks because they had to. It became a state mandate. So at the end of the day, all they did was put again, the same thing. People that didn't really want to understand what mask meant. There was this social stigma associated with masks that I don't understand. It's not an emotional thing for me. I oftentimes, as an engineer, you're a little less associated with emotions when it comes to decision making, because you look at the data and the data tells you kind of what to do. You don't put too much emotion to it, but there's a lot of emotional stuff about that. And I'm sure it's tied to, the scariness of a pandemic and all that stuff. But eventually, yeah. So there's a long discussion with the owner that I had, like, explaining that, like, look, you need to adopt a mask standard. Here's why they work. I'm an aerosol scientist. This is what I do for a living. I have a background in this, blah, 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 blah. And they just didn't care. People just didn't care. At the end of the day, I found a different daycare. They liked masks. They actually I ended up working with them and setting up anyone who wanted in the office, good known masks. I brought them in. We fitted a bunch of teachers that were interested in, because some of them were caring for elderly parents and they're very nervous, being around kids, being around a lot of people. What if I bring this home to my elderly parent that was at home with me? They were very nervous about that. So they wanted, like, the best protection they could get. And I just explained to them, well, here's how it works. Here's how you wear it. They were very receptive about that. So in the end of the day, I had the advantage that I could just switch schools with my son.
That sounds like that worked out pretty good.
Yeah, no, it did. It was actually a very eye-opening experience about dealing with people and trying to explain complex issues in a pandemic where there's a lot of unknowing information, right? It's a mess.
Yeah, and I would think from the people that you mentioned before with that initial daycare, like I started seeing, like, I started wearing a mask in March of last year, and there wasn't a provincial mandate yet, so it really really trickled on in the general population of people wearing masks just a little bit at a time, until it got to maybe 20%, until the mask mandate came in, and then went from maybe 20-30% to everybody. I feel that all the other people at that point were not wearing masks just because they have sort of they want to be a part of the status quo, and if they're unsure about it, they're sort of substantiated by the status quo, and they get that sort of affirmation. But as time's gone on, like there's a certain crowd that are just adamant about not wearing masks, and it's just it's become a part of their presentation or their livelihood, their ideal. Have you done anything to try to reach out to that crowd?
Yeah, I think I always approached any of my stuff from the context of, I'm not going to assume anything about my audience. I'm not going to assume that if you don't wear a mask, you're a bad person. Look, here's the information about masks. And I always looked at it as a slight advantage, which is saying, when we talk about respirators, or I like to call them protective masks. So you'll sometimes hear me kind of jump between those terms. And I like to use the word protective mask because respirator has this very like industrial kind of connotation to it. Like you're going to sound like Darth Vader and you're like, I'm in a respirator,
Yeah.
And so like people don't get that, like, like an N95 is a respirator, but like, so I use the word protective mask because then it kind of separated like, oh, well, my cloth mask. Well, you're wearing a cloth mask. You're not wearing a protective mask. And so I'll use that term, but I like to use that and talk about how you can wear a mask to protect yourself. And I know a couple people personally who were like, I didn't care about masks until you told me about these protective masks. Because like, why would you wear the cloth mask? They don't protect you from anyone. I like these because now I'm going to get protection. So I'll wear this because I'm protecting myself. I don't, and it's kind of like, I mean, it's a little selfish on their part because like, I'm basically saying I don't care about other people, but again, I'm not going to judge you. Like, who knows what your information status, like what information you were given, what information you had access to. So I'm just going to assume, assume you're a good faith actor. You're trying to do something different. And so I just approach it like, hey, you can protect yourself. Right. And that's the beauty of protective masks is that, a lot of times I heard people having a lot of anxiety going into stores and even some level to myself, because I would run into people that weren't wearing masks and I'm wearing this cloth mask. I'm like, and I know, I'm like, man, this thing ain't doing much for me and you're not wearing a mask at all. Like, this is not a good situation. And to me, the protective mask just gives you the comfort to know, like, if it's well fitting, like, and this exposure is short, so I'm going to only interact for a few, 15 minutes or whatever, like the risk to me as an individual is very, very low. And so suddenly the anxiety of going to the grocery store, of seeing unmasked people around you, it's like, whatever, I got what I need. You can do whatever you need to do for you. I got what I need from me, for myself personally. I don't have to worry about it, right? I don't have to be like, oh, that person's not wearing the mask, they're not following the rules, right? You're just like, whatever, they're not wearing their mask, who cares? I have mine on. And I think that was the thing we missed in this whole thing, is that, if we go back and look at the pandemic, we should bring in these psychologists and people that do this sort of behavioral analysis, because public health, epidemiology is different than public health. I know that's not my space, so I don't pretend to be an expert in either of those things. But listening to, let's say, Dr. Fauci talk, or listening to someone like, I can't remember if he's from Minnesota now. What's his name? He's super famous from Minnesota. Michael Osterholm, right? Epidemiologist.
Oh, yeah.
But epidemiology to me is very different than public health, because public health is about messaging this, right? How do we sell this? How do we play into those psychological aspects of it? And how do we minimize risk, right? And so they're very different things. And so we had a lot of epidemiologists talking. I didn't hear a lot of public health experts talking. And again, it's the kind of the mismatch of skill sets, where, I don't know who sits on the World Health Organization, but I know a lot of epidemiologists sit on there. I'm not sure how many public health experts sit on there. So it's kind of those kind of things. So I always just approach it, look, I'm going to be neutral about this topic. There's no reason to I'm not going to change anyone's opinion by saying a certain mask or talk about the political aspect of it. Because in the end of the day, my goal of the whole project was just to get people aware of masks and get protective masks on people's faces. I mean, if I could get 1,000 masks or 10,000 masks on people's faces, I would have felt like that was super successful. And statistically speaking, like, someone would have life may have been saved. Like, that's the kind of ratios we're talking about here. So I was like, okay, I can sacrifice some time to maybe do that. So that was my perspective on that situation.
And like you're dealing with a lot of data and a lot of different items. Like, if you get weighted down in the political aspect of it, you can get nothing done real fast.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, when you can show, like, hey, look, this mask protects, and I can measure it, and I can show you the data. And you know what? How about you watch me do it live? That's why I started doing live streams, right? Because people are kind of curious about, like, how are you doing this? Like, how do I know you're just making this up? Like, here, watch me test this. You can watch the counter read it. You can see that when I have this hose off, I measure 30,000 particles per cc. And when I connect it, I measure almost nothing. The only way that happens is that something removed the particles from the air. And guess what? The masks do that, right? And so you can show the data. You can watch me do it, right? So I was very transparent about that. I was always going to be very clear about that. I'm going to be very transparent how I do this measurements, the limitations of my method, and all that stuff that's really important to people that have skepticism towards people on the internet telling them what to do. You shouldn't listen. Even if you listen to this podcast right now, you should always ask, like, what is the motive behind it? Are these really experts, right? Like, you should always question these kind of things and kind of draw your own conclusion. Like, is this a trustable news source or information source? Like, is some guy named Aaron on YouTube really the person you should listen about masks? So I did my best to say, here's why I think I understand it. Here's my background. I'll show you all the data. I'll show you how I'm analyzing. I'll talk about my limitations, right? Just to be as transparent as possible.
Yeah, and I just watched a bunch of your videos today, and the beginning of at least one, you mentioned, I don't have any, financial connection to any of these companies. I have no business incentive. You go down the line and make sure that this is just, sober scientific analysis.
Yeah, well, I try to make it somewhat entertaining, but I know it's kind of a boring topic. But yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, like that's what you should look for. Like and I was always explicit like that. I wanted people to realize that I had no financial incentive on this. I was spending my own money to do it because the second money gets involved, you should question, right? When I read, I mean, I've seen some, some of my colleagues, doing promotional videos. I saw one of them on a late night TV ad for an air purifier, and I was kind of a little aghast. I was just like, really? Like, how can you be unbiased in your research when you're being paid by them to do something specific and then are on TV advertised as that? Like, it's kind of like, to me, there has to be this clear delimitation. Like, this is pure information. I don't have any bias. I don't care what the results look like. It doesn't matter to me. These are the results, right? I think that that's so important in scientific research to always disclose, any possible financial thing. And you see it happen. It's a byproduct when you got to make money and you have to have a job and you have to do research. I can kind of understand how this stuff happens, but I had the advantage that it wasn't going to affect me. I still had a job. This is just a hobby, quote unquote hobby.
Kind of makes me depressed that that's still a thing in those late night TV ads. I wish they would have gone by the dinosaurs already.
Oh, you have no idea how shocked I was I didn't see it personally. Someone else had sent me the link to it. And like, dude, do you know this person? I was like, yeah, I do know that person. I was like, kind of like, ugh, like, I don't know, man. I wouldn't be putting my name attached to that like that. Like, you're supposed to, yeah, I don't know. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah. Fair enough. So what are some of the devices that you're using to measure the masks?
Yeah, so I use like real scientific instruments. So actually what's funny is that the kind of epicenter of aerosol is really in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. So one of the world's largest manufacturers of aerosol equipment is called TSI, and they're up in Shoreview, Minnesota. And they actually bought the company I used to work at. So the little company I used to work at, who was owned by a former professor at the U, who shockingly was the professor, he was the lead of the particle technology lab, the aerosol group at the University of Minnesota, which is kind of like world famous for aerosol research. He formed his own company. I'd worked there with him at MSP Corporation. TSI also spun off of that. So like we were like the epicenter. So I used real scientific instruments. Now, I bought them used, and because I have a background and I could fix them up and I kind of knew how to work and repair them. And so I would do that. And so I had them in my basement because I would buy these on eBay. You'd find them sometimes for really cheap, like an instrument that would sell for $50,000. You could buy for $500, right? And so new. I mean, the stuff I'm using is like 20 years old, but it still works great. And so, yeah, I bought I'm using real scientific grade instrumentation. The device I used was a TSI 3025A. It's a condensation particle counter. Basically, it counts any particles from like 2.5 nanometers up to a micron, which is in the role that I was working on. I was using about 60 nanometers, so like well within the range of measurement. And so if you went to go buy all that equipment that I was using in my bathroom, it would have cost you like $70,000, $80,000, and I had to pay a few $1,000s. So it was kismet. Like I said, like I happen to have like everything you need. I was like, I guess I could test mass. I have an N95 companion, which is used to like all the punch ports, all of the equipment that you'd use to test mass. I had all of that from another machine. I had this really high-end particle counter. I had everything I needed, and I had an aerosol generator it's the exact one they use to do fit testing on respirators for the OSHA test standard, right? So the exact equipment that would be used to fit those, I had all of these like pieces together. I didn't have the full raw equipment because again, I always broke stuff. So I had like 90% of it's good, like all the other stuff's good, but 10% of it didn't work. So I could kind of piece together just all the equipment that you would need, and I've seen other researchers use a very similar method, which was really cool to see. I mean, I think that they thought of it independently. So I'm not saying that they had copied me or something like that, which would be cool if they did anyways. But I'm sure they come to the same conclusion independently, but ended up using almost the exact same test methodology that I did. I think they were out of University of North Carolina, Raleigh. And so they ended up doing a very similar thing, just doing the same test method that I was doing, just like what's called a total inward leakage test. Basically, you're just measuring counts outside the mask and then measure the particles inside the mask. And so it's a combination of what went around the mask, the leakage of the mask, and what was captured by the particles, what was captured by the filter media of the mask. So it's kind of this like combination measurement. It's a really good measurement, in my opinion, because it captures the real world experience, right? You can take the mask material and test it independently and say, oh, it's 99%. But if your mask doesn't fit anyone's face, it doesn't really give you 99% protection. So it was a good way of testing like a real world kind of worst case scenario. So yeah, it was kismet. I like I said, when my wife said that to me, I kind of was like, why didn't I think of that? Like, I literally have all this stuff in the basement just sitting there doing nothing. What am I going to do with it? Oh, I guess I can repurpose it for this.
Now you have a bathroom mask lab.
Yes. Well, yeah, I've repurposed it back to a bathroom now, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
All the equipment's back in the basement.
And so you mentioned the KN94s before, and what I'm wondering your thoughts on is, as those sorts of masks became more available and a lot easier for consumers to buy, it just seems, just from my more personal observations, that those types of masks never really caught on that much. Some people are wearing them and all that, but I see most people are just wearing a surgical mask, or they're more concerned about buying a mask based if it has a a Pikachu on it or something
Right.
like that, and are just wearing the crappiest cloth mask imaginable for presentation or vanity reasons. Like, how come people, even though if they can't get an N95, and I can understand a bit, somebody doesn't want to wear a P100 to Costco or something like that.
Yeah, no,
like,
no, I wouldn't do that, actually.
yeah, like, well, why hasn't people going out to get those sorts of masks and just wearing any sort of crap and thinking that that's adequate, how that's been able to persist still until now? Is it just that the press coverage has been zero on the variation between masks, and of course the government messaging, and what do you see as the main factors for that occurring still?
I think it's all the above. I think it's nice to look at countries like South Korea. I'm not sure what their case count is, or well, not that we want to always mention it, but like, death count is sometimes a little bit more of a scientific way to look at like how effective your mechanism of containing COVID is. So not that we should be using that, but I was going to Google here really quickly what the Korean COVID deaths. So I'll have to look. Apparently my internet down here is not working as well as I thought it was, but I'm not sure what the number was. When I looked a while back, it was like it's less than 1,000. So I'm not sure. It was a few months ago. But you look at Korea and you're like, okay, so how did they manage to have per population or per capita much, much, much lower death rates than US? And you think about it, it's like, okay, what are the big differences that Korea did? They had mass testing standards. And they also have mass testing, sorry, to be very clear, MASS, like large population. They were testing constantly to try to contain it. And they had a big advantage is that they had KF94, KF80s, and good mass standards already present. And they ensured that all citizens had access to it. So they had limited exports. They guaranteed, they had like price controls, so they weren't getting too expensive so that everyone could purchase them. And you look at their death rate and it's like, so I'm looking right now, it's 1,971 deaths. Compared to the US, that's over 500,000. I mean, per capita, it's just
way off.
Oh, yeah. So they did an excellent job. And so you think about, okay, well, what's the difference? What's the difference between the US and what's the difference in South Korea? Okay, so there's definitely some different things that are happening in terms of like cultural differences for sure. Like masks were already part of their lifestyle. Government messaging, they ensured everyone had masks. They had masks that were stylish and cool, right? And it's getting better over time. Nowadays, you go to KF94s in South Korea, they're printed. They look just like cloth masks. I mean, you're getting print quality that look like a cool cloth mask, except you're getting like 95% filtration efficiency, well, even higher than that. It's like 98% plus. So you're talking the looks of the cloth mask and the protection of a real protective mask. Convenience, they're ear loop, they're not all headband. Now there's some argument about what that mask, general population mask standard, should it be headband, should it be ear loop? The scientists and the nerds can debate that. I personally am in the camp of keep it convenient. You want people to wear stuff, keep it convenient. The more convenient it is. So ear loops oftentimes are probably sufficient for a general population mask. That's kind of the assumption that South Korea has made. I kind of agree with it. But you look at the US. Okay, so the US never has a general population mass standard. So they only have industrial N95s. Certainly are not stylish by any means of the word. And people do care about that. You had confusion. The CDC has yet to even state that you should wear an N95. They're saying a surgical mask. And then they're like, well, what if you take a surgical mask and put a cloth mask over, right? The double masking. All of these were terrible solutions when well, it's not a terrible solution. Like, it's better than just a cloth mask, yes. But
well, it is, yeah, technically that, but just like the way that came across, and like people that were already jaded, it just sunk things so much lower.
Yeah, I mean,
When that happened, I just like put my hand on my head and like
it made. I mean, from an engineering perspective, it made sense a year ago, right? If we had that communication standard a year ago, I would say, okay, that makes sense, right? Surgical masks are readily available. They're very efficient in terms of melt-blown production. They're very quick and easy. They're not as complicated as other respirators, so you can generate a lot of them very cheaply. So all of that made sense, right? But what failed is like, okay, then you combine that with a cloth mask to help the seal, because surgical masks don't seal very well. Oh, that makes sense. But why are we publishing that in February when you have too many N95s and no one can get those, and you don't have any other mask standards that are like KF94 or general population mask standards, and you're not even talking about airborne spread? I mean, you kind of they started acknowledging in December. It's like the messaging was so off. And again, it highlights to me like epidemiologists versus public health, right? How do we communicate these things to a general population? How do you explain something that mass is not a? I mean, I don't know how many hours of video I have. I think I probably have like 10 hours of video of one person talking about masks, and I feel like I didn't cover it all. It's a nuanced discussion. Just tell people what they need to wear. Just say, you wear this, put the special seal of stamp of approval on all the masks, and if you got the special seal, you're good to go in the store. If you don't, you got to wear a different mask, right? Like, it could have been done so many different ways. And so the US standard, again, we don't have a general population mask standard. We advocated and beat to death the cloth mask was the thing. People were dying on the Hill to have people wear cloth masks. I still don't understand. I mean, I don't understand the opposition to it. I don't understand why people were willing to die on that hill. You should have said, okay, fine, cloth masks don't work as well as they do. Let's go to ones that do. Let's use melt blown, right? Let's use surgical masks. Let's use, like, just say, okay, fine, you're right. Other opposing party, you're right, cloth masks don't work. But you know what these do, and we have the science and they protect you, right? You could have pivoted, right? There's technique to all of this. And I think that the US was just a mess. I mean,
many countries where that
well,
like with the masks, it's it's uniform and
but I think everyone looked to us, right? You had,
definitely.
I was reading people in Sweden talking about how the CDC says we don't need masks, and I mean, in Sweden, if you want to talk about a messed up situation, from a scientific perspective, you listen to what's coming out of some of the
I did a whole episode on that. Yeah.
You're just like, you're arguing science here. Like, it's not how this disease spreads. Like, you're kind of like arguing against science at this point. You're already wrong. I mean, the data is like showing against you. You're eventually just going to be, proven wrong. Mm-hmm. It's not always fun, but people are looking to the U.S. as the standard. They're saying the CDC doesn't require it. So if the U.S. doesn't need it, then why do we need it? Because the CDC is like the best in the world. I mean, I guess I would argue maybe not anymore. And so, what happened in the U.S. became a method of people that didn't want to understand it and didn't want to believe in aerosol spread use the CDC and the CDC's announcements about mask standards as a way to globally spread that. And so, in the end of the day, the epicenter of bad masking and a bad policy about that was right coming out of the U.S. And so, in the end of the day, I looked to if we want to be world leaders, not that I'm like some American exceptionalist, I don't think that's the case at all, but like there's always this notion of American exceptionalism and that the CDC should have been the best in the world. And I was like, realistically, sorry, look at our deaths per capita. We didn't do the best job. Like, the data is the data.
Yeah, Pax Americana with masks didn't go very well.
Yeah. So, I think going forward, we have a ton of technology. I look at this and I'm like, you see what's coming out of Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is like the epicenter of cool mask, general population mask right now. Like South Korea hit it with the quality right out of the gate. They were just putting out tons of masks, of high quality masks for the general population, very cheap. So Hong Kong kind of has this right mixture of technology and manufacturing, right? So tons of manufacturing and melt blowing. A lot of I didn't realize this. I kind of consider myself knowledgeable, but you're kind of blown away when you learn about other how much a little I knew about Hong Kong in reality. But this right combination of entrepreneurialism and a little bit of distrust of the mainland China. If you're following Hong Kong politics, you'll understand why there's a distrust of like the mainland. So they want to make their stuff here because they don't trust what's coming over. And so like home, they want to make it at home. They want it high tech. They have great manufacturing tools and capabilities. Like what a perfect epicenter to make cool masks. And the masks that are coming out of Hong Kong are just knocking it out of the park. I mean, like the first print stuff, and I'm pretty sure most of that print stuff was coming out of Hong Kong, and that's how it got picked up in South Korea. It came out of Hong Kong. Some of the masks, I just did a live stream a little while ago because I was wearing them myself, and I was like, I got to test these things. They're too good. I mean, ultra breathable masks that are so breathable. I mean, they're way more breathable than any cloth mask or surgical mask that I've ever worn. Right. So you got, and they got colors, and they have designs, and they're ultra breathable, and they're comfortable, and they have like good design ear loops. Like you could wear them all day, and they're pretty, I have to wear them at work all the time. I have to wear eight hours a day. I'm wearing a mask. They're comfortable. And I look at this, I'm like, wow, the innovation that's happened in 1 year in Hong Kong is amazing. And I look to the US and I say, what has the US made? We made a bunch of bifold masks that were like KN95 knock. I mean, they basically bought Chinese mask machines and were churning out N95s in the US, which were just bifold, KN95 mask machines. You have 3M making the same stuff that they've always made, very industrial, And again, like we missed the opportunity for a general mask standard. We could have had people that love the cloth mask designs and prints, and you combine that with that, and that's and very breathable, so they're not hot because that's like people glasses fogging and all that stuff. So see where they complain. And to me, the irony is the Biden administration was like, "Hey, we have this $100,000 prize to who can design the best mask," and people are like, "Hey, Aaron, you should do that." I'm like, we've already lost. Hong Kong is already like they're ahead of us. Like even if the best masks, I would just buy one from Hong Kong and then sell it here, and people would think I'm a genius. Like they're already ahead of us. Like Hong Kong is like, and South Korea too. They're on it now. Like they're ahead of us. The U.S. makes great. I mean, 3M makes some of the best masks in the world. I would never argue that, but they're meant for industrial settings, and that's what they're good at. But they're not good for general population. So, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, the U.S. was, like I said, if you want a summary of the mess of this episode, it's a mess. It is a mess. Someone's got to go clean it up, because otherwise, the reality is we'll have another pandemic again. Maybe it's not. Maybe hopefully it's 100 years from now. Maybe it's over 200 years from now. Long enough that it's out of the minds of everyone, and we have better technology. But the reality is that like this can happen again, and we should be prepared, and we should know how to do it, and we should be acknowledging the pathways of transmission. And we should be using science first and politics second. Well, or none, I would argue.
Not at all would be nice.
Yeah, exactly. Just follow the science and let the scientists argue. I mean, there's nothing wrong with having debate about what mechanisms are. We should be having healthy debate among scientists, and there should be this methodology of like hashing out, okay, what is our strategy, and have the public health people involved so that you're looking at risks and how do you message, and go hash it out and keep the politics. But unfortunately, don't ever read about the 1918 pandemic, because otherwise you'll feel like you're just in deja vu. Like don't ever read the books. That's my one thing. I made that mistake of reading like some of the books about the 1918 pandemic and masking and people that were anti-mask in 1918 and everything that happened. You're literally reading it. You're like, oh, this is happening now. This is happening. Oh, those people are here too. And you're just like, it just blows my mind that 100 years later, we're literally doing the same things all over again. We have the technology, and we're putting 1918 technology on American faces to solve a 2021 problem. And or 2020, I guess, at the start of this 2020 problem. It blows my mind. 100 years, we made no progress.
Yeah, and in some ways it's worse. There was so much spread when you had, the worst part of the war was the last year, and you had people living in or fighting, living in the most dreadful circumstances, and so spread was being exacerbated that way. And so the world was focused on that. Like we don't have this extremely massive war to contend with simultaneously. So what the hell's our excuse? So it's so dismal.
Yeah. No, it leaves a lot to be decided. But I mean, I think the real positives that came out of this, though, to me, is just like the fact. I mean, and I listened to your previous podcast too, right? So some of the previous ones, right? The acknowledgement that COVID is airborne, to me. And the methodology of like acknowledging about aerosols and just getting people, the acknowledgement that aerosol scientists exist and engineers exist is like the most amazing thing from this. Not because I personally want to benefit from that in any way, I don't, but it just solidifies that there's a group of experts in the world that have been studying this for 50, well, I mean, arguably you might say 80 years plus, and for surely with high technology instruments sometime in the 70s. Right, that they exist and that they're experts in that field, and that we should be listening to experts in that space. Just because there's some small niche field doesn't mean they're not not there. And so bringing aerosol people to the forefront is amazing, because it's the same challenges that we have with climate change, the same challenges that we have with pollution. All of these things are driven by these tiny little things in the air. And it's a big deal. And so, bringing that spotlight to that and tackling some of the bigger health issues will be, I think, a real big positive of this, right? I mean, no one's going to argue that masks don't work in the next 10 years, right? When it comes, even in the flu, I think if we show, and not by we, I mean, just like the scientific community, if you can show that flu is spread by aerosols, that's mind blowing, because then you're like, you got to revisit how you design hospitals and airports and schools. And we have to look at like, hey, indoor air quality, it turns out, is just as important as all of the other things that we do from a health and safety standpoint. Clean Water Act, all that stuff. We have to look at air quality indoors now too as a big impact in terms of people's safety and health. So I think there's some real positives that come out of this as well from the scientific perspective. But
as long as that doesn't get politicized too.
Oh, it will be. Everything. Like it doesn't involve money. If yes, it will be politicized.
Yeah.
Kind of a general rule of thumb to follow there. But yeah, it is what it is.
Yeah, well, we'll see how that plays out over the next decade. But looks like I got to let you go soon here. But before I do, question for the present. Sort of the idea with the CDC and in the United States now is that masks are taking a back seat with the vaccines coming in. So what are your thoughts on this the CDC, and from what I recall, the executive branch of government's idea that it sort of vaccine or mask dichotomy, and then the idea that people are can't wait to throw their masks into the back of the closet with the old violin and move on from that. So what are your thoughts with those new policies and masks for the present with the vaccines and how that's going forward?
I think it follows in general with this whole discussion. It's a mess, right? It's a complete mess, right? From my perspective, if you're trying to be risk adverse, you would, for me, using vaccination to eliminate masks it made no sense at all. And I think there's been some data that came out of Rand or one of the polling places that had shown that most people didn't really care. The people that weren't wearing masks, and they're not going to get vaccinated either. Whole nother topic. Whole nother topic in itself. It didn't make any sense. And I think the way it was broadcast made no sense. Again, it kind of comes back to like, where's the public health expertise in this space? Where are we communicating these messages in a clear and concise way and giving businesses predictability? Because it just made a chaos for businesses. In Minnesota, it was really chaotic because Fauci came out with it. Our governor it was originally saying, okay, we're gonna end the mandate, sometime in June. Here's our targets. If we hit these vaccination levels, we're gonna do it. And then 2 days later, it's like, hey, guess what? On Friday, tomorrow, the mask mandate's up. And now all these businesses are like, well, what am I supposed to do? I have 1 day to prepare for this. Like, it's just about predictability for businesses. It didn't make it. Whether the data and the data shows what the data shows. I'm not going to argue with Fauci. The data clearly shows that the vaccines are awesome, which is yay science, right? That is so amazing. That's awesome. But at the end of the day, we have to have predictability for businesses because they're trying to figure out liability for their aspect, right? With their employees. You have OSHA that's on now saying that we have to be cautious. OSHA was starting to put in some pandemic measures saying, hey, we need to protect our workers from this and mask standards for that. And now suddenly you're just going to throw all that out because you want to end your mask mandate like super early. It didn't make any sense from that perspective. So it didn't give businesses any planning. You also had the aspect of like, just because, and in Minnesota, like our vaccination rate was going great, but Pfizer takes 5 weeks from your first dose to you're fully vaccinated. So you're going to tell people, go get vaccinated, but I'm ending mask mandate tomorrow. Well, they have 5 weeks until they're vaccinated fully. Like that doesn't really make any sense. You should set it.
I wasn't sure about this. It clarified for me then. Is it, so you don't have to wear your mask the day that you get your first dose?
Yeah. Well,
seriously?
It's actually shocking to me how many people didn't understand that they weren't fully vaccinated until 5 weeks at the end.
Well, I don't blame them. There's who none of them are putting out any effort to clarify that.
Well, I think the information is there if you go look for it, but it wasn't like clearly. Again, it's one of those like public health like messaging things. Like, how are we messaging this in a very clear and concise way? We did it with the mask. Every building you walked into showed a person, putting a mask on, and that was indicated in that business required masks. Like, you didn't have to read the little sign to say, well, this business requires a mask. If you're, you just, they want masks, put masks on, right? How could you not have shown shot plus 5 weeks fully vaccinated, right? Like, some simple messaging, like, have it when you hand the pamphlet out, because I had all these pamphlets about signing up for the COVID-19 tracking, or like the vaccination through the VSafe from CDC, right? So I could like give my feedback about how my vaccination went. Why wasn't that just given to you as a pamphlet? You'll be fully vaccinated in 5 weeks from today. Assume that you're not, you have limited protection until that, or, you can message however you want. It's the same thing. It's just about, how it's a mess. It's a mess about how we communicated this, how scientific communities didn't communicate. So the mask mandate, just the sudden repeal of that, and the sudden notion that we're just going to throw you. I mean, look, the data shows what the data shows. I don't have any problem with saying, hey, by the end of the summer, we may not need masks at all. We may have to revisit going into the fall. But for right now, if the risk is really low, you don't need to wear a mask. If you're immunocompromised, if you are still waiting for your vaccine, which you should have got already, go get your vaccine. If you're not vaccinated, please. But if you're waiting, there are good options out there. So like KF90, so there's protection out there. Now, again, I'm kind of annoyed because those immunocompromised people, are you telling them how to protect themselves? Are you saying go wear an N95, immunocompromised person? No, they're not. They haven't said that yet. So I kind of like, the messaging is so wrong here, because we're saying, hey, if you're not vaccinated, but if you're immunocompromised and you can't be vaccinated, or the vaccine won't effectively work for you, well, figure it out. It's a mess. It is a mess. So I was very annoyed by that. I think it could have been done so much better. But it's par for the course. It's just par for the course for what we've been doing this whole time. So, lessons for the future. Someday, hopefully, someone is not 100 years from now listening to this podcast and going, God, is this happening again? It probably is.
It's grim to think about, but yeah, let's leave it there on that happy note. So
yeah, well, statistically speaking, it'll be unlikely. So
right. So where can people who are listening keep tabs on you?
Yeah, so I mean, I've called myself a retired, but I still, if you go to YouTube's Aaron Collins, I just use my full name because it was my channel that had a bunch of bicycle videos that suddenly became my mask videos. So if you find bicycle videos on there, then you hit the right spot. But yeah, Aaron Collins on YouTube, although I was smarter with the social media. Mass Nerd, at the Mass Nerd, not the Mass Nerd, sorry, at Mass Nerd on Twitter and on Instagram. I haven't been too busy on there. I'm going to start turning that up a little bit. I had to take a break for a month and like do normal life stuff for a while. It was basically like working 2 full-time jobs, and I have a kid and stuff. So it's like, I kind of have to get back to regular life, but I'll be doing some more mask reviews from like ultra breathable masks, and also doing a lot of kids masks, because kids aren't vaccinated. And so some of those kids may need to wear masks if they're immunocompromised or have other things like, may have cancer or something like that. And, so we don't want to leave those people behind. And we'll be going back to school in the fall. The question was like, what will happen in the fall? So let's just get prepared for it. Maybe everything goes great and all the kids go back to school and we don't have to wear masks for kids. I hope that would be awesome. But if that doesn't happen, I'd like to have the data to say, okay, hey, we're getting back to school. Here's the mask you need to buy. Not surprisingly, KF94s for kids are amazing. So there are good options out there. So if anything, if you take away anything from listening to an hour of me blabbering away about masks, is that there are good options out there. You can wear an N95, you can wear a KF94, you can wear a European FFP2, and some select KN95s, although they are much, much better. I think there's much less fakes in the KN95 space now, because melt-blown prices, the base material, that technology is dirt cheap again. So like, it's even cheaper than probably when we started the pandemic. Now there's so much of it manufactured. So like fake KN95s are pretty rare these days, I would even argue. So if you're wearing a cloth mask still and you're not vaccinated, or you have a reason that you can't be vaccinated for a good reason or whatever, there are good protective options out there.
Cool. There we go. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Thanks for listening to this episode. The music you hear on this show is from the Jeff Lapp Trio out of Montreal. Find them at jefflapp.com. Shout out to Tara for doing the graphics for COVID On Air. A huge thanks to my editor, Jeff, at Bean Co. Studios in Regina, Saskatchewan. Please visit endcoronavirus.org for more information on ECV. Click on Join Us. Through that, you can volunteer with ECV, and you can subscribe to our newsletter, which is full of great information shot straight to your inbox from our delightful newsletter editor, Tracy. Also, please check out the blog at ECV, and hats off to Scott, our impeccable blog editor. You can find ECV on Facebook and Instagram and on Twitter at NCovid19. You can find me on Twitter at Mr. Farden. It's at MrFarden. Until next time.